September 1944. The Allies were winning. Paris had been liberated. German forces were retreating. The Western Front was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. For the first time in years, it felt like the end was within reach. And that is when the plan was born. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery believed the war in Europe could be ended before Christmas. One bold thrust, one decisive blow, a rapid armored advance through the Netherlands, across the Rhine, and straight into the industrial heart of Germany. It would bypass the Siegfried Line. It would outmaneuver the Wehrmacht. It would shorten the war by months. The operation was called Market Garden. Market, the largest airborne assault in history. Garden, a ground offensive racing north along a single highway to link up with the paratroopers. More than 35,000 airborne troops would drop behind enemy lines, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of gliders, an armored column pushing through a narrow corridor no wider than a two-lane road. It was ambitious. It was daring. It was described by senior planners as having a 90% chance of success. But confidence can be dangerous. Because while Allied commanders were celebrating momentum, German forces were regrouping. Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem. Intelligence reports warned of armored resistance in the very areas where lightly armed paratroopers were about to land. Those warnings were noted, then discounted. The belief was simple. Germany was collapsing. The enemy was too weak to respond. Speed would solve everything. And for a few days in September 1944, it looked like they were right. But wars are not ended by optimism. They are ended by logistics, intelligence, and the ability to hold ground under fire. And in the flat fields and narrow roads of the Netherlands, a perfect plan began to fracture. Because at the far end of that long corridor stood a single bridge over the Rhine. Arnhem, and it would become the place where confidence met reality. The idea was elegant. Drop 3 airborne divisions deep behind enemy lines, seize a chain of bridges stretching from Eindhoven to Nijmegen, and finally to Arnhem. Then send the British XXX Corps racing north along a single elevated highway to link up with them. If everything moved on schedule, Allied armor would cross the Rhine within days. Germany would be exposed. The war in Europe could end in 1944. Operation Market Garden began on September 17th. The skies filled with aircraft. Paratroopers from the U.S. 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions dropped near Eindhoven and Nijmegen. The British 1st Airborne Division descended near Arnhem. Polish paratroopers waited in reserve. Initial reports were encouraging. The 101st secured key bridges. The 82nd fought toward Nijmegen. Resistance seemed scattered, but the cracks were already there. British intelligence officers had intercepted reports that 2 SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, were refitting near Arnhem. Dutch resistance sources confirmed armored units in the area. Some analysts warned that Arnhem was not lightly defended. Those warnings were pushed aside. Commanders believed the German units were too damaged to pose serious resistance. The assumption was that speed and surprise would overwhelm anything left in the region. But surprise cuts both ways. When British paratroopers landed miles away from the Arnhem Bridge, farther than ideal due to concerns about anti-aircraft fire, they lost precious hours marching toward their objective. Hours the Germans used to react. Within a day, German forces were reorganizing. Panzer units were moving. Communications were restored faster than Allied planners expected. Meanwhile, the ground advance, Garden, slowed. The entire operation depended on a single raised road running through low, flooded terrain. If that highway was cut, everything behind it would stall. And it was cut. Again. And again. German counterattacks struck the corridor, forcing British armor to stop, regroup, and reopen the route before continuing north. Traffic jams stretched for miles. Tanks, fuel trucks, ambulances, all funneling through a road barely wide enough for two vehicles. Every delay mattered. At Arnhem, only a small portion of the British 1st Airborne Division managed to reach the bridge. The rest were pinned down in suburbs and open ground by rapidly strengthening German resistance. Radio communications failed. Units were isolated. Reinforcements were delayed by weather. The timetable, the backbone of the entire operation, began to collapse. And at the northernmost objective, a handful of British paratroopers now held one end of the Arnhem Bridge. Behind them stood German armor. Ahead of them, no relief in sight. The perfect plan was no longer unfolding. It was unraveling. At Arnhem, the illusion finally broke. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and roughly 700 men from the British 1st Airborne Division reached the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge. For a brief moment, the objective was secured. They had done the impossible. Lightly armed paratroopers had taken a major river crossing deep inside enemy territory, but they were alone. German forces reacted with speed and coordination few Allied planners had expected. SS Panzer units that were supposedly refitting were now advancing with armor, artillery, and experienced infantry. Frost's men dug in around the bridge. They waited for XXXX Corps. They waited for the sound of British tanks coming up the highway. It never came. The ground advance was still fighting its way north, slowed by blown bridges, counterattacks, and the simple reality of moving heavy armor down a single, exposed road. Every delay at Eindhoven and Nijmegen echoed northward. Time was no longer an advantage. It was the enemy. German units surrounded the British perimeter. Tanks rolled into Arnhem. Artillery pounded buildings where paratroopers had established defensive positions. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies disappeared. Casualties mounted. Radio failures made coordination nearly impossible. Requests for support went unanswered or unheard. For 4 days, Frost's men held their end of the bridge under relentless assault. They fought from houses, from rubble, from burning buildings. Eventually, German armor pushed through. The perimeter collapsed. Survivors were killed, wounded, or captured. The bridge at Arnhem was never fully secured. Meanwhile, at Nijmegen, the U.S. 82nd Airborne launched a desperate daylight river crossing under heavy fire to seize the bridge there. They succeeded, but the delay cost crucial hours. Hours that Arnhem did not have. By the time XX Corps finally reached Nijmegen and crossed, the northern objective was already lost. The last remnants of the British 1st Airborne Division were trapped west of Arnhem, surrounded and shrinking. The phrase would come later, but the truth was already clear. Arnhem was a bridge too far. By the end of September, the operation was collapsing. The corridor that had stretched like a lifeline through the Netherlands was fragile and constantly under attack. German counteroffensives cut the highway repeatedly. Supplies slowed. Reinforcements stalled. At Arnhem, What remained of the British 1st Airborne Division was encircled west of the bridge. They were exhausted, outnumbered, running out of ammunition. German artillery and armor pressed in from all sides. Air support was inconsistent due to weather. Polish reinforcements dropped south of the Rhine, but were unable to cross in strength. The relief force never arrived in time. On the night of September 25th, under rain and darkness, the remnants of the division withdrew across the Rhine in small boats. Around 2,400 men escaped. More than 6,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. An entire elite airborne division had effectively been destroyed. Overall Allied casualties during Operation Market Garden exceeded 17,000. The Germans suffered heavily as well, but they held the final bridge, and that changed everything. The Rhine remained uncrossed. Germany's industrial heartland remained shielded. The war in Western Europe would continue through a harsh winter. Momentum shifted. Just 3 months later, Hitler would launch the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, proving Germany was far from collapse. Market Garden had been designed as a knockout punch. Instead, it became a prolonged struggle. Afterward, when asked whether the operation had failed, Montgomery described it as 90% successful. History remembers it differently, not as a near victory, but as a cautionary tale. Operation Market Garden was not a disaster in the traditional sense. It did not destroy the Allied armies. It did not reverse the course of the war, but it exposed something far more dangerous than defeat: overconfidence. By September 1944, Allied forces had grown accustomed to German retreat. Normandy had broken the Atlantic Wall. Paris had fallen. The enemy appeared disorganized and exhausted. Commanders began planning for victory, not resistance. Market Garden reflected that mindset. Intelligence warnings about SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem were minimized. The risks of relying on a single narrow supply route were accepted. The logistical strain of advancing armored columns across vulnerable bridges was underestimated. The belief was that speed would compensate for everything. It did not. The operation revealed a hard truth. Airborne troops, no matter how elite, cannot hold key objectives indefinitely without rapid reinforcement. Planning timelines must match operational realities. And when intelligence contradicts optimism, it demands attention, not dismissal. The failure at Arnhem extended the war in Western Europe by months. The Rhine would not be crossed in force until March 1945. In that time, thousands more lives would be lost across the Western Front. And yet, Market Garden also showed something else: the resilience of the soldiers who fought it. American paratroopers crossing the Wall River under machine gun fire. British troops holding isolated positions for days against armor. Polish forces attempting to reinforce a collapsing perimeter under impossible conditions. They executed their orders. The plan failed them. In hindsight, the operation has been reduced to a phrase: a bridge. Too far. But the meaning runs deeper than geography. It was ambition stretching beyond logistics, confidence outrunning caution. A reminder that in war, momentum can create illusions, and illusions can cost lives. Market Garden did not end the war. It lengthened it. Because war does not bend to boldness alone. It answers to preparation, adaptability, and respect for the enemy. And when those are ignored, even the most perfect plan can fall apart.